This is a 2019 paper from the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition by Jansen et al. It's a counterbalance crossover trial looking at the osmotic stimulation of vasopressin and how it acutely impairs glucose regulation. This study explores how vasopressin, a hormone that is best known for regulating fluid balance, can affect glucose control. The prevalence of chronic metabolic dysfunction has become a major public health issue. The number of people globally with diabetes has risen over the years. ABP is measured via the surrogate marker copeptin. Studies involving ABP have demonstrated that it plays a significant role in glycemia and glucose tolerance. Epidemiological studies report an independent association of copeptin with hyperglycemia, higher type 2 diabetes risk, diabetic cardiomyopathy, impaired insulin sensitivity, and death. Traditional methods of increasing AVP via dehydration with exercise or heat exposure might independently affect glucose homeostasis. The objective of this study is to examine the acute and independent effect of osmotically stimulated AVP on glucose regulation in healthy adults. The hypothesis is that the osmotic stimulation of AVP would increase glucose area under the curve during an oral glucose tolerance test. The null hypothesis is that the means of the subjects are similar between the two experimental trials. There were 60 total subjects, 30 males, 30 females. To avoid enrollment of subjects with undiagnosed diabetes, HbA1c was measured. Female participants were significantly older with less lean body mass than the males. This study had a counterbalanced crossover single-blind experimental design. Participants did both conditions in random order. There was a 120-minute saline infusion followed by 240 minutes of an oral glucose tolerance test where participants ingested 75 grams of glucose and blood was sampled every 30 minutes. There was an ISO trial with 0.9% sodium chloride infusion, which served as the control, and a hyper trial with 3% sodium chloride infusion to stimulate AVP. The two trial days were separated by 7 days for males and 1 menstrual cycle for females. Female subjects with a regular menstrual cycle were tested during the early follicular phase of 2 consecutive menstrual cycles to control for the effect of reproductive hormones on body fluid balance. These were the primary outcomes that were measured. The primary outcomes were glucose and insulin area under the curve and insulin sensitivity. The secondary outcomes measured included copeptin, glucagon, cortisol, plasma volume, C-peptide, renin, aldosterone, osmolality, and plasma sodium. These outcomes helped determine if the changes in glucose were due to vasopressin alone or other hormonal pathways. The study design successfully increased plasma osmolality during hypertonic infusion and elevated AVP, which was measured via copeptin. During the hyper trial, plasma osmolality, plasma sodium, and copeptin increased and remained elevated during the entire 6-hour protocol. The positive integer for the glucose area under the curve during the oral glucose tolerance test was greater in the hyper trial compared to the iso trial. The positive integer of the area under the curve for insulin during the oral glucose tolerance test did not differ between trials, which suggests that AVP may impair glucose regulation independent of insulin changes. Baseline values of serum glucagon were not different between the two trials. However, the area under the curve of glucagon during the oral glucose tolerance test was significantly greater in the hyper compared with the iso trial. The higher glucose area under the curve during the OGTT in the AVP stimulated condition could be the result of the activation of the V1A receptors and the V1B receptors, explaining the increase in glucagon concentrations. The HPA axis was not activated. The renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system was suppressed, which confirms that there was an osmotic rather than a volume or stress-related origin of the vasopressin changes. Osmotic stimulation of vasopressin causes a greater hyperglycemic response during a glucose challenge. This supports a link between hydration and metabolic health, likely through increased glucagon concentrations. These data suggest that osmotically stimulated AVP could acutely impair glucose homeostasis. Vasopressin can raise blood glucose acutely, likely by stimulating glucagon secretion. This study suggests that chronic mild dehydration through persistent AVP elevation can contribute to long-term metabolic dysfunction and diabetes risks. Maintaining adequate hydration could help modulate vasopressin activity and help support healthy glucose metabolism. This can be a potential preventative strategy for metabolic diseases. Thank you.